Welcome back, everybody. I'm still Stephan Trüby. I'm still standing together with my colleague Philipp Krüpe here at the IgmA, at the Institute für Grundlagen moderner Architektur und Entwerfen, the Institute for Principles of Modern Architecture and Design here at University Stuttgart. We would like to move on now to the second part of our IgmA Day, which is we are actually trying to look back to a former SToA event, a former event of the so-called Stuttgart Talks on Architecture. This SToA event happened a few weeks ago in May 2020, where Philipp Krüpe and I organized a public debate about the architectural and urbanistic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. The title of this event was Facing COVID-19, Politics of Elements of Architecture. Our two guests were Marianna Charitonidou and Andrea Bagnato. But before we come to the two presentations of our two guests, then please allow me to share with you a few slides, a few observations about possible urban and architectural consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Facing COVID-19 could mean also facing anti-corona lockdown protests, which happened all over the world, as we know, but especially also here in Stuttgart. Facing COVID-19 could also mean facing a cellularization of territories. Germany, it seemed for a while, almost looked like the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation in the 17th or 18th century. Facing COVID-19 could also mean the danger of national solutions, with byproducts as these here from a disturbing website called Germany Mouth Mask Collections, with kind of right-wing radical masks. Facing COVID-19 could also mean a change of consumer behavior. Here the New York Times diagram showed that the gun sales spiked after the COVID-19 pandemic. Facing COVID-19 could also mean facing maybe the relative end of the urbanistic virtue of densification. Here we show kind of a collage, a speculative collage by David Tommaso Ferrando, excuse me, please, based on the cover by Colin Rowe and Fred Kötter, Collage City turned into COVID City. And this could also mean the relative end of the culture of congestion. Here on this cover, again, a collage by David Tommaso Ferrando is a variation on Delirious New York. This end of the culture of congestion, we are experiencing it everywhere in the kind of urban fabric under the headline of social distancing. At this point, I would like to hand over, as I mentioned already, to my colleague Philipp Krüpe.
Thank you, Stephan. Thank you for this short introduction. The first presentation will be held by Andrea Bagnato. Andrea Bagnato is an architect by training and a book editor. Currently, he works for the Sharia Architecture Biennale, the Piet Swartz Institute, and the Architectural Association in London. He does a broad research on the architecture and ecology of infectious disease. His research considers both historical and current case studies. He publishes his research on different media, for instance, the Journal of the Canadian Centre of Architecture, or the eFlix magazine. And the topic of tonight's presentation is about the malaria control and the fascist architecture in Sardinia. Well, why did we invite Andrea Bagnato? Well, obviously because a debate about the infectious disease COVID-19 in terms of spatial matters is very urgent. But apart from this, the COVID-19 pandemic had also caused issues which are specifically relevant for our research project, Right-Wing Spaces. We are faced by an ascending authoritarian spatial orchestration of our private as well public space. And these restrictions under these circumstances are in a way totally new for us. I'm talking especially about my generation, I here in Europe have never been faced by this kind of restriction. That's the reason why it is advisable to look back and scrutinize comparable pandemics like the pest, the Spanish flu, or malaria. If we scrutinize the reactions of infectious diseases by governments, or even whole political as well as economic systems, we should always analyze their reactions not only in the light of an appropriate disease control, but also in the light of their real and ideological intentions. Let's stop at this point and hand over to Andrea, who will talk about malaria control and fascist architecture in Sardinia.
Hello, my name is Andrea Bagnato. I am not an academic, but I am an architect by training. In the last couple of years, I've been working mainly as a book editor, and currently I'm head of publications for the Sharjah Architecture Triennial. At the same time, I have been working on a long-term research project that's called Terra Infecta, and it's a research that looks at the interactions between architecture, ecology, and infectious disease. I started working on this project in 2014 when I was a student at Goldsmiths at the Center for Research Architecture. And after that, I kept expanding the project through a series of grants and residencies. So I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you about a small section of the research I've been doing, which concerns specifically the role of epidemics and disease during the fascist period in Italy, and the way that fascism used and mobilized the idea of disease and contagion in order to achieve its own ends. This is part of a longer story, but I think that just focusing on the fascist period, it is possible to understand many of the dynamics that characterize the relationship between modernity and disease at large. So the site where I've been doing the most research is Sardinia, the island of Sardinia. And I've been concentrating on malaria, which, as you know, it's not an urban disease, but it's a disease that really concerns the landscape. So for me, it was important to think about malaria because it's really a way to understand what does disease do outside of the city. If, let's say, in architectural history, we know quite well the relationship between disease control and urban planning and architectural design, I think that we know far less about what was happening on the landscape, also at a broader territorial scale. So this is the reason why I started working on malaria. As you might know, malaria was endemic in southern Italy and all over the Mediterranean until very, very recently. So we're talking about the 1940s, 1950s. So that's 2 generations ago. Sardinia, among the malaria landscape, was probably one of the worst hit places of all. It was really, the mortality rates from malaria were equivalent to those in sub-Saharan Africa today. So it was also the site of many programs and projects to try and rid malaria. And my argument is that the effort to eliminate malaria was indeed a cover for a much broader political agenda, a set of territorial transformations, which touched upon cities and architecture, but were also like concerning a much bigger scale. Of course, this is not to say that malaria did not exist or that it was not a problem, but as I will show now, it was also a device that was turned by the state into an emergency in order to enforce certain economic and social transformations. In particular, there's a place in Sardinia which is delineated by the white dot on the map on the west coast, which is the site of a new fascist town that was built in the 1920s on a formerly malarial swamp, so which was drained and dried up. And I'm going to tell the story of this place. It used to be called Mussolinia, after Mussolini, of course, and it was rechristened Arborea after the end of the war, to remove, of course, the references to the name of the dictator. It's a quite curious place that I've been visiting several times now with the help of a photographer that I'm working with. It's a place that is at once decrepit. It feels like half abandoned, but it's also extremely productive. It's a small town in the middle of a agricultural area, which is one of the most productive places in the whole of Sardinia. There are remnants of fascist architecture here and there. This is the Casa del Fascio, so the former headquarters of the fascist party, which is now a youth center of sorts. But all around is basically an agricultural landscape that looks as if it was lifted straight from northern Italy, in fact. And this will be part of the story that I'm going to tell. It's indeed a wetland landscape, although most of the wetlands that used to be there for centuries are gone, and only on the outskirts of the area there are still some swamps and marshes left. And the building you see here is Hydrovora, which is essentially a water pump that was built in 1935. And this is the building, the machine that keeps the whole area dry. It's still working as if it was working in 1935. And so it's a place that also requires a constant upkeep in order to maintain its functioning as an agricultural landscape. Of course, you start to guess how, let's say, to what extent fascist architecture was used to monumentalize the act of drying up the land and turning it into a productive landscape. So this dam, that is now no longer active because it's been replaced by a larger dam, is where the story really begins. It was built in 1918 by a group of industrialists and bankers from Milan. So it was built with private capital. And it created one of Europe's largest artificial basins at the time. So this is just upriver of the floodplain. And of course, the idea of the dam is that it would, by creating this artificial water basin, flooding an entire valley, it would permit to regulate the flow of waters downriver, and so it would make irrigated agriculture possible. This is really, really crucial and a disruption, let's say, in the history of Sardinia that had never used irrigated agriculture until that point. Sardinia was a place where agriculture was only taking place as in a subsistence scale, or essentially just using rain. It was rain-fed, and there was also a lot of shepherding. So it was not a region that lent itself to capitalist agriculture. But of course, that was the project indeed. So this is the first map of what the landscape of Mussolinia would become. So you can see that the idea is essentially to cover up all of the lakes and ponds with a uniform grid. So each plot in the grid would be indeed a plot of land to sell to farmers. What is quite funny fact is that the grid has the same module as Manhattan, exactly the same size as the grid of Manhattan. We don't know if that's incidental or not. Of course, this was an agricultural grid, not an urban one. So the project, after the dam was built, the project to dry up the plain, the valley, and to turn it into an agricultural flatland, again began way before Mussolini went to power, which was only in 1922. But somehow this place was already called Mussolinia because Mussolini was a well-known figure already in Italian politics. So it seems like there was a kind of bottom-up wish to dovetail into the emerging fascist politics. So the works of reclamation took up the first part of the 1920s, the first half of the 1920s, and by 1928 it was all dried up and it was all carved up into this grid. And the town of Mussolini was built at the center of the grid as a sort of like, indeed, like urban center from which the whole agricultural valley could be managed and run. But of course, the idea was that farmers would not live in Mussolini itself; they would live on the land in small houses, in individual houses. So that the model was very much that of the yeoman farmer, the kind of independent farmer that would till his own land. Again, this was a big rupture with the history of Sardinia, which, as I said before, was an island of shepherds above all. So what is quite striking in terms of so we can actually distinguish two phases of architecture in the architecture of Mussolini. And the first phase that you see here doesn't really have anything to do with the idea that one has of fascist architecture, because until the mid-1930s, the idea was to make this look like northern Italy, essentially. So the architecture that was chosen was sort of like average, almost like a caricature, a pastiche of like northern Italian provincial rural architecture. So it's fairly unremarkable upon a first sight, but the point is that this type of architecture, this type of like rural architecture in Sardinia, like lifted off northern Italy and, let's say, dropped in the middle of Sardinia, was of course a way to impose a new idea of normality, a new idea of what the norm would have to be, which was indeed capitalist agriculture, a different type of relationship with the land, a different mode of production. As a matter of fact, there are like many voices from the time that say that the land was not productive at all, because we actually know that like reclaimed land is not very fertile. Mussolini became the site of also a chemical experiment. So it was also one of the first places where fertilizers were tested in Italy, and where new varieties, hybrid varieties of wheat were tested, such as what can be seen in this photograph with two like fields where two different types of wheat are grown in order to see which one gives better yield. So it's really like a laboratory landscape. And this is, of course, something that works very well with fascist agenda, which was that of like making Italy independent from the point of view of agricultural production. So Italy had to stop, according to Mussolini, buying wheat and produce from abroad, and it had to become completely self-sufficient. So of course this idea of like, you see how the landscape, such a landscape becomes really like important in terms of like nation making, like fascist nation making. But now let's go back a second to architecture. So as I said, like until 1935, the architecture didn't have anything that was openly fascist. But this starts to change around 1935. And why only now? Because the mid-30s is the moment where fascism starts to invest more openly and more massively in architecture as a form of self-representation. 1935 is also the moment of the invasion of Ethiopia, so the illegal invasion of Ethiopia on the part of the Italian government. So this is really like a turning point in fascist Italy. The government becomes much more openly colonial, and also tries to intervene much strongly in the perception that Italians have of the government. And architecture is a major tool in reshaping the minds and the behaviors of Italians. These were the actual words of Mussolini, that architecture needs to change the way that Italians were living in order to make a new subject, a new fascist subject. So we must understand fascist architecture in this way, not just in terms of its formal qualities. So in 1935, we start to see like different type of buildings appearing even in Mussolini, which recall the formally rationalist experiments of other parts of Italy. The most famous one was this Casa del Balilla, so it was the youth, let's say, sports center, built by an architect from Sardinia called Ceas, which was quite like obviously like recalls indeed like the experiments that were taking place in other parts of Italy. So this is one of the fascist buildings. The other one that I showed before already was the Casa del Fascio, or also by Ceas, with this kind of like trademark tower that was to rival, of course, the church bells and the church tower. No? And then the third striking building that we find in Mussolini is the water pump that I also showed in the photographs before. So the water pump is not a rationalist style, but it's a much more futuristic. No, it recalls really the work of Santelia, I think, and it was designed by a different architect, Flavio Scano, also in 1935. And I think that the reason why the architecture of the water pump is so different is that the water pump was really like almost a futuristic device. No, it was almost like indeed like a spaceship of sorts. It was the one building that could keep not just the town but the whole valley dry. And so it was necessary like to characterize it in a different way. So it was almost like or to be perceived as like a magic object, I believe. Like there was like a mystic quality to this building that could keep the land dry. No? So the whole promise of fascism to make a new land was resting on this one building, far more than it was on the Casa del Fascio or the Casa del Balilla. But now, who actually lived in Mussolini? And it's quite interesting to point out that it was not Sardinians, but it was people from northeastern Italy. So if we go back a moment in the 1920s when the city is built, it's not Sardinians that start to move there. It's people from Veneto, so the region around Venice. Why is that? Because according to the planners of the city, the Sardinians were not well suited to this type of endeavor. So they were not farmers. They were not naturally good farmers because indeed they were shepherds. So the planners said, well, we should actually bring in farmers from that are used to this kind of like way of working the land. So we have to go and look somewhere else in Italy. And they thought about Veneto. Why Veneto? Because Veneto was a particularly poor region in Italy where people were really like quite desperate, and it had also like a really kind of exploitative relationships between landlords and peasants. So they thought that essentially they could, by bringing Veneto people to Sardinia, they would bring obedient farmers that would not protest too much. They would just like work the land and do whatever they were supposed to do. The second factor, like really crucial, is that Veneto families used to be really large. They were like numerous families with many children. This was in contrast with Sardinian families, which tended to be small and like closer to, let's say, our idea of nuclear family today. So there was again like a kind of eugenetic idea in selecting a certain type of people that would breed a certain type of new Italians. The archives of Mussolini that are now visible in the city of Oristano are full of request letters that were written by the peasants themselves who could apply to get a plot of land in Mussolini. And each request was scrutinized attentively, not just by the management of the estate, but also by the police, because of course it was important to make sure that the peasants were not, for example, communists or socialists. Otherwise they would be rejected. So they would be scrutinized in terms of the family composition, in terms of their political allegiances. So this is a register of some of the families arriving in Mussolini from Veneto. So there's of course the name of the head of the family, the father, and then the right columns show the different components of the family divided by gender. So there was of course a really strong gender element to the whole project. Women were essentially seen just in terms of their reproductive capacities. So men were supposed to manage and run the agricultural activities of their plot, and women were supposed to manage the reproduction, the family reproduction. They had to have enough children. By enough, it was a lot of children, not just 2 or 3, but like 5 or 6 or 7. But of course, this will mean more arms, and enough boys, because of course boys were again like seen as like more productive. So families were chosen also on their abilities to reproduce. A word on the urban plan of Mussolini. As I said, it was designed as not as a town where a peasant would live, but just where they would go for services and exchange and whatnot. So the urban plan is really like simplified. It's almost like a cartoonish town if one goes there. There is like just one central square with the church on one side, the city hall on the other side, the school on the third side, and then the workers, let's say, circle on the fourth side of the square. So, and this is the only, essentially the only public buildings, with the exception of a covered market just nearby. The idea was that this kind of design would, of course, allow for a generalized form of social control. So all of the public functions were visible to everyone. This would prevent the inhabitants of the area from gathering, for example, in other forms that were not those prescribed by the managers of the estate of Mussolini. So it's really like an architecture that, however simple it might look, it's actually like highly attuned to an idea of like controlling the behavior of people. This kind of idea of social control was also reinforced through the protocols to protect the population from malaria. So what fascism does is really like it furthers the idea that malaria is a matter of individual responsibility, not a matter of public health. So you have to enforce a certain set of behaviors in order to defend yourself from malaria. And if you do fall ill, it's your fault because you haven't followed the instructions properly. The state doesn't do anything in terms of like providing, for example, medicines. And the instructions, if we go and read the kind of like booklets that were distributed to the population, are really like disciplining. So they, for example, they prescribe that peasants were not to stay outside in the evenings. They were not to congregate. You know, there was a sort of like social distancing idea, which didn't make sense in epidemiological terms, but of course was indeed a way to prevent the possibility that peasants could create like political, any form of, let's say, political space among that was not under the control of the state, which was, of course, the biggest danger of all, that peasants could organize among themselves and, God forbid, turn into communists. So I'm now wrapping up. As is well known, the efforts of Mussolini to invest on land reclamations were very celebrated in the media, both in Italy and abroad. So he used land reclamations to build consensus, to build a whole imaginary and narrative. It was often like photographed bare-chested in the fields, like working the fields, and these kind of representations were actually taken up very much by the international media. So it's very important to state that well into fascist regime, even a respectable newspaper such as the New York Times was buying into fascist propaganda very easily. In spite of this investment, malaria didn't really disappear from Italy during fascism because it was mostly, of course, a cosmetic thing. I mean, Mussolini was a small drop in the ocean of malarial wetlands in Italy. So it was only like the Pontine marshes around Rome. They were small parts that were reclaimed and turned into like new towns. But malaria in Italy was far more prevalent than that. And fascism wasn't really interested in fighting malaria. So malaria only disappeared after the Second World War with the intervention of the Rockefeller Foundation, which put in place a huge project to test the newly discovered DDT, and Sardinia was really a test site for like the largest scale DDT spraying project ever seen. let's say it was only, let's say, in the late 1940s that malaria really disappeared. But that's really another story. So thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to take any questions.
Okay, welcome back. Our next guest is Dr. Marianna Charitonidou. Marianna is a postdoctoral research fellow at the chair for the History and Theory of Urban Design Institute for the History and Theory of Architecture, the GTA, at the ETH Zürich. She has studied and worked in Athens, Thessaloniki, London, Paris, and now Zurich. Currently, she works on different projects. One project is about the status of the photographs that architects take during their travel by car. Another one is about the post-war reconstruction agendas of Konstantinos Doxiadis and Adriano Olivetti in Greece and Italy. The project we want to talk about tonight, this project is about the investigation of the architectural element of the balcony. The research project is being conducted at the ETH and led by Professor Tom avermaete. It is a continuation of Rem Koolhaas' project, The Elements of Architecture, on the Architecture Biennale 6 years ago. As most of you may know, Professor Stephan Trüby was the research director of this Biennale. Now I'm looking forward to watch Marianna's presentation about the balcony as an urban element in the face of COVID-19. Let's have a look.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to have this opportunity today to talk about the balcony as an urban element, given that these last months it was very central in our lives. Thank you for this invitation. To start, it would be interesting to refer to the etymology of the word balcony. Balcone derived from balco, which in Old Italian means scaffold, and one, which is an augmentative suffix. It means big scaffold. Balconies differ from their cousins, terraces, because they are cantilevered, and viewing platforms because they are attached to dwellings. The balcony was one of the elements that was investigated in the Venice Biennale of 2014, curated by Rem Koolhaas, which was devoted to the topic Elements of Architecture. The section of the exhibition that was devoted to the balcony, curated by Tom avermaete, was structured around 3 narrative lines. The first narrative line concerned the political role of the balcony, referring to both its micropolitical and macropolitical dimension. The second narrative line concerned its focal role, while the third narrative line concerned its liminal role. The political role of the balcony becomes evident in the case of the renunciation speech by Eva Perón in Buenos Aires in 1952 and the first address of the Liberate Mandela at the Cape Town City Hall in 1990, among other cases. The second narrative line, which concerned the focal role of the balcony, included a full-size model of a Haussmannian balcony, which should be understood in conjunction with the bourgeois public sphere in 19th century Paris. The Haussmannian balcony was confronted with the modernist transparency of the Bauhaus at Dessau and an Algerian balcony by Fernand Pouillon, in which vernacular and modern definitions of the public sphere coincide. The third narrative line of the section of the exhibition devoted to the balcony concerned the liminal role of the balcony and included an ensemble of photographs of collective housing projects. Its objective was to render explicit the capacity of the balcony to articulate the interior and the exterior, the private and the public, the individual and the collective. It paid special attention to its informality and to its capacity to function as an in-between articulating the private and public realms. The exhibition intended to shed light not only on the spatial characteristics of the balcony, but most importantly, on its different cultural appropriations and its experiential complexity. The exhibition also included a prototype of a masrabiyya, which is an architectural element characteristic of Arabic residences. It is a type of projecting oriel window enclosed with curved wood latticework located on the second story of a building or higher, often lined with stained glass. The life in the balcony is an important aspect of the quotidian life in the Mediterranean cities and elsewhere. As Bernardo Jacquat remarks in his recently published text entitled "What's in the Balcony? The In-Between as Public Good," the genius of the balcony is to assemble people who live within proximity but who are otherwise strangers around a common world of events, experiences, and issues. The very force of the experience of the balcony lies in its in-betweenness, that is to say, in the fact that it combines privacy and publicity, as well as interiority and exteriority. The degree of its publicity and exteriority varies from culture to culture. I could refer, for instance, to the architectural element called masrabiyya. Beginning in the Middle Ages, enclosed masrabiyya balconies with ornate latticework were built across much of the Arab world to allow residents to enjoy the fresh breeze while adhering to Islamic laws of privacy. We can see here some examples. In ancient Greece, the houses had timber balconies that looked towards the atrium, which was the main source of light and air towards the interior space of the houses. In ancient Rome, in the Forum, noble spectators had their seats on the balconies, which were called maenaena. A maenaeum was a balcony or gallery for spectators at a public show in ancient Rome. In the Renaissance, balustrated balconies became a fixture of many Italian buildings after architect Donato Bramante unveiled the design of his banister-bound Palazzo Caprini in Rome. Another architectural element that shares some characteristics with the balcony is the loggia, which is a covered exterior gallery or corridor, usually on an upper level or sometimes ground level. The outer wall is open and is usually supported by a series of columns or arches. Loggias can be located in either on the front or side of a building and are not meant for entrance, but as an outdoor sitting room. From the early Middle Ages, nearly every Italian comune had an open arched loggia in its main square, which served as a symbol of a communal justice and government and as a stage for civic ceremony. The loggias were especially popular in the 17th century and are prominent in Rome and Bologna. During the days of the quarantine, due to the Covid-19, the balcony acquired a dominant role in our quotidian life because it is the architectural component that allows the citizens to have access to the public sphere.
Avviciniamo il tutto! Va benissimo! A voi tutti!
In order to grasp its significance in our everyday lives, it would be useful to refer to three notions: that of the threshold, that of the common world, and that of rhythm analysis. Firstly, to shed light on the notion of the threshold, I will draw upon Aldo van Eyck's approach. Secondly, the notion of common world is understood here as Hannah Arendt defined it in her seminal book, The Human Condition. Finally, to analyze the notion of rhythm analysis, I will focus on the way Henri Lefebvre understands this notion in his book entitled Rhythm Analysis, Space, Time, and Everyday Life, which was originally published as Éléments de rythmanalyse in 1992. Aldo van Eyck elaborated the notion of the threshold as a way to designate physical spaces such as courtyards, lobbies, terraces, porches, and balconies that connect various spatial and psychological registers within the city. Van Eyck's conception of the threshold is related to the intention to reconcile polarities such as inside and outside, and private and public. Balconies are places open to contingency where people gather to witness events in common. Balconies have the capacity to put citizens along with their neighbors before matters of common concern. Balconies transform residential buildings into a public in potentia. Moreover, balconies act as liminal spaces that bridge public and private life. In the case of the balcony, architecture fosters common knowledge. In order to better grasp the status of this common knowledge, we could refer to what Hannah Arendt called common world. In her book entitled The Human Condition, Arendt argues that common sense is crucial because it constitutes a kind of sixth sense through which all particular sense data given by the five senses are fitted into a common world, a world which we can share with others, have in common with others. As John Nixon notes in his book entitled Hannah Arendt and the Politics of Friendship, for Arendt, the world is neither entirely in our heads nor entirely out there. It is the intersubjective space within which we relate to one another through our five senses, hearing, sight, smell, taste, and touch, and in so doing constitute our common world. According to Bernardo Jacquat, balconies may be nominally private, but they are just as much a continuation of the public realm up in the air. To better understand the role of the balconies in maintaining the sense of the public realm up in the air during the days of the pandemic, we could bring to mind David Harvey's following remark regarding the impact of the daily experience of the public realm on how we understand our political praxis and our place in the world, in his text entitled The Political Economy of Public Space. We do not, after all, experience the city blankly. And much of what we do absorb from daily life in the city surely has some kind of influence on how we are situated in the world and how we think and act politically within it. The experience of the quotidianity in the balcony contributes significantly to the production of what Arendt calls common world. For Arendt, the common world is the very human condition. The distinction between the notion of the public space and the notion of public sphere is also useful for understanding the importance of the role of the balconies during the quarantine in maintaining the sense of having access to the so-called common world. Henri Lefebvre notes in Rhythm Analysis, Space, Time, and Everyday Life, which, as I already mentioned, was originally published as Éléments de rythmanalyse and was his last book. In order to grasp and analyze rhythms, it is necessary to get outside them, but not completely. A certain exteriority enables the analytic intellect to function. In order to grasp this fleeting object, which is not exactly an object, It is therefore necessary to situate oneself simultaneously inside and outside. A balcony does the job admirably in relation to the street, and it is to this putting into perspective of the street that we owe the marvelous invention of balconies, from which one dominates the road and passers-by. Provocatively enough, Lefebvre also remarks in the aforementioned book that the arithmanalyst will have some points in common with the psychoanalyst, though he differentiates himself from the latter. The differences go further than the analogies. He will be attentive, but not all to the words or pieces of information, the confessions and confidences of a partner or client. He will listen to the world, and above all, to what are disdainfully called noises, which are said without meaning, and to murmures, rumeurs, full of meaning, and finally, he will listen to silences. Now I would like to explain some of the spatial characteristics of the Polykatikia balcony in Greece. In order to grasp the specificity of the Greek balconies, one should interpret them within the context of the emergence of the typology of the so-called polykatikia, which in Greek means multi-residence, polykatikia, from poly, meaning multiple, and katikia, meaning residence. The birth of polykatikia is closely related to the need to respond to the great increase of Athens' population due to the arrival of the refugees from Asia Minor after the defeat of the Greek army in August 1922 and the so-called Great Fire of Smyrna in September 1922. The polykatikia model is based on the adoption of the horizontal property law of 1929, which allowed and even promoted the emergence of the system of antiparochi, which is a cashless contract between the owner of a building site and an entrepreneur who would assure rapid construction of the polykatikia without any financial help from the state, and was based on the exchange of one's house and or building site for one or more flats in the newly built polykatikia, which would replace the existing building in the site. Thanks to this system, there was a great increase of the building activity, which resulted in the modernization of the Greek cities and offered the possibility to large numbers of citizens to own their own apartments. The system of antiparochi also helped to respond to the necessity of building new polykatikias to host the new populations of Greek citizens who moved from smaller cities and villages to Athens after the destruction of the former during the Civil War, that is to say, between 1946 and 1949. The construction of polykatikias was intensified in the late 50s and reached its peak during the 60s and the 70s. One of the most dominant characteristics of the Greek polykatikias are their extensive outdoor spaces. The large and repetitive linear balconies, which in many cases are continuous and wrap the facades of the polykatikias. The size of these balconies is generous compared to that of the balconies of the Haussmannian buildings in Paris, with a width of at least 2 meters in most of the cases. Their size makes them capable of accommodating various activities of the everyday life. They function literally as an extension of the indoor spaces and activities. In most cases, inhabitants place plants, furniture, and other home appliances on their balconies. During the warm months of the year, the balcony becomes the site of collective family life, of eating, gathering, and entertaining. Contrary to their Parisian counterparts, most of the polykatikias balconies are equipped with textile sunshades that can be moved up and down with the help of a metal mechanism to adapt to the specific needs of the inhabitants in terms of sun and privacy. Those who migrated to the city found in these large balconies a substitute for the private open-air spaces that they were accustomed to from their rural dwellings, but now situated in the dense urban matrix. The polykatoukia soon became symbolic of Greek modernization thanks to its contribution to the hygienization of housing, achieved mainly due to the balconies and amenities such as central heating. Nonetheless, the symbolic value of these balconies for their tenants relied upon an understanding of the benefits of sun in a more spiritual way, which aimed to challenge the rigid hygienic symbolism that was attributed to balconies in northern modernist contexts and should be understood within the context of the politics of Mediterraneity in southern Europe. Within the northern modernist context, much emphasis was placed on technocratic aspects through slogans such as light, air, and openness, while for the Greeks, the balconies not only contributed to the improvement of the hygienic conditions of the residential buildings, but also offered access to the spiritual aspects of natural light. Moreover, the balconies of the Greek polykatoukias contribute significantly to the optimization of the passive heating and cooling strategies. Thanks to their generous size, their vegetation, and their textile sunshades, balconies in Greece have an important impact on the sustainable environmental design of the polykatoukias, contributing significantly to the air circulation and to the enhancement of the daylight conditions of the indoor spaces. The notion of light is, for instance, very dominant in the work of the modernist Greek architect Aris Konstantinidis, whose design approach was based on the combination of primitive and modern techniques and materials under the condition of maintaining contact with nature. Konstantinidis blamed modern architects and modern society for having lost their connection with nature, and through his reference to the notion of light, aimed to reinvent the relationship of modern architecture with nature. To better grasp the symbolic and political value of the experience of quotidian life in the balconies in Greece, we can think of their contribution to the production of what Hannah Arendt calls common world. The experience of quotidianity in the balconies, which breeds public and private life, fosters the creation of common knowledge. Another concept that is useful for understanding the symbolic value of the balconies, especially in Mediterranean cities such as Athens, is that of threshold that we analyzed before, between the remembrance of a rural pattern of living and the spiritual symbolism of light. The balconies of the polykatoukias obtain a very specific physiognomy, which is very protagonist during these days of the pandemic. Thank you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Well, I think it's difficult, let's say, in general, of course, to judge on the matter of authoritarian derive. I think for sure I want to stress that I believe that the decisions that were taken for the sake of preventing the disease from spreading, and that not that there was a hidden agenda of sorts or a conspiracy, let's say, to reduce democratic freedoms. But what I found striking in Italy, and what I think I was trying to bring up to with that, let's say, intervention on Twitter, is that the first things that the state addressed were very telling, because they were indeed like the state first targeted nightlife, public demonstrations, and open air socializing, and only afterwards moved on to target other let's say elements of society. So that was what I thought was quite revealing. So there was almost as if like a subconscious idea that say nightlife was dangerous already before the virus, or because it's, of course, it means that people are not doing anything that is productive and cannot be easily controlled. And at the same time, public parks are, let's say, something they were immediately considered as dispensable, something that is not really necessary, so we can just close them, even though there is no evidence, of course, that the virus can be easily transmitted outdoors in the open air. Of course, it can happen, but it's really, really remote. Whereas, of course, the efforts should have been focusing on offices, hospitals, and individual homes. So for me, that kind of, like, let's say, targeting of social life, especially outdoor social life, was quite revealing. And I don't think that it's necessarily authoritarian, but it's certainly worrying, and perhaps comes from a tendency of privileging only those forms of interaction that can be economically productive, of course.
As I tried to mention before, I think that projects such as the ones from Takis Zenaitos and Jona Friedman and other projects that address the home office conditions and the dispersion of the city will become very much in fashion, because they imply also another way of understanding the city and all its different components. So I think it won't be in fashion so much the compact city, but the opposite. Because the virtual aspect will become much more apparent to everybody. It will change all the aspects, not only the working conditions, but also the way we'll entertain ourselves. For example, Zenaitos, when he did this project on electronic urbanism, he also designed the furniture in a way that would be used also for entertaining and everything. Like in a way, like Archigrams projects, but he underlined the social aspect and how all the different components of the urban infrastructure will change. I think this kind of projects will become much in fashion.
Andrea?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's, in a way, it's already happening in the sense that, of course, there have been already calls to move back to an idea of like suburban life. This is, of course, something that, as you already said, it has been seen a lot in all of the epidemics, the major epidemics in the last century and a half. No, of course, that's how the Garden City was born. The idea that somehow like urban life is threatening, is dangerous because too many people live together. And I don't think that that's what actually is going to happen, for the simple reason that for so many people it's not really an option. I think if we look again at what was happening in cities, at least in European cities, in the last decade or so, we do have, let's say, we do have a reality whereby it's increasingly difficult to live in city centers because it's so expensive, and so people can only afford small spaces. So I wonder if some people, I think, will just give up on the idea of the big city. But that's really, of course, referring to those, let's say, large urban agglomerations that have been attracting resources, such as New York, London. In Italy, it was Milan, perhaps Berlin from a certain perspective. But the point is that if the resources, let's say the economic and social resources, the labor, let's say, infrastructures, culture remains concentrated in big cities as they have been doing in the past decades, it will be a really difficult choice, because the reason why let's say that the way that neoliberalism operates on a territorial scale is, of course, that of absorbing everything onto like some small few centers and depriving the rest. So as a result, of course, cities that are medium or smaller size have become really impoverished, which I think is something that we have seen really very much in Italy in the last 20 years. Medium-sized cities have lost not just inhabitants, but they have lost shops, they have lost culture, they've lost schools, they've lost hospitals. These, of course, under different processes of privatization and liberalization. And of course, again, concentration of resources. So I don't know that, let's say that the wish to have more space in your home will be enough to undo this tendency. I think we need probably to bring forward a much stronger discourse if we want indeed to revert the most damaging aspects of this centralizing tendency that neoliberal urban development enacts. Well, here in Italy, and I guess in places like the UK, for example, one thing that has become really clear is the limits of privatized healthcare system. So the region of Lombardy, where I'm speaking from, is the worst affected part of Italy and in the world. And it was also the region that more than any other in Italy has been privatizing its healthcare system. So I think that might be a potentially beneficial outcome, is that there will be a realization that it hasn't worked. Like simply, I think it hasn't worked. But of course, it's really saddening that it took this epidemic, for a collective realization of that. I don't know if that will be enough to rebuild a welfare state, and I think I'm not a political scientist, so it's difficult to make, let's say, bigger predictions. We might also, let's say, a possible outcome, best case scenario, but also there is another possible outcome, which, if you look at some signals, which is one where everything is subsumed to the needs of industrial production. So the whole, let's say, social organization is completely determined on what the industry needs, which is a little bit what has happened here. So the industry doesn't really stop, because it cannot stop, but so everyone else has to stay at home and not do absolutely anything in order for, let's say, to keep the risk acceptable, the level of risk acceptable. So that's actually a fairly dystopian scenario, I think, that we need to be really, really careful about.
All the communal spaces of big buildings will have to be reinvented. And also, you talk about the housing buildings mostly, but I think also the public space of public buildings will change a lot. But for the residential buildings, I think the corridors and the communal space will be reinvented a lot.
Well, I think it will be interesting to see what happens to handles and any kind of related elements, because even though it's probably not the case that handles are a particularly dangerous element, of course, the idea of precaution and the need to be, let's say, to be careful has already taken hold. So we might easily go toward a scenario where we don't have any sort of door handles anymore, and any automated technologies or whatever. I think this is already something that happened in Hong Kong after SARS in 2000 and 2003. So that might be likely, I think.